Today we're going to be talking, this is the title of our lecture, about normativity and transphobia in popular culture. If anybody accessed this slideshow or PowerPoint on D2L more than about an hour and a half ago, then the version that you access is slightly different, actually slightly longer than this version. I took out some slides that are repeat information for you all that we don't need to go over again. Now, if folks remember, before reading this, if folks remember last week, we talked about biological determinism, right? This idea that biology, and in particular pertaining to gender, this idea that this biological dimorphic ideal determines social identity, including gender, right? So this idea that there is this black and white hormonal world, this black and white chromosomal world, this black and white genitalia world, all of which are biological, all of which are distinctly male or female with no gray area, and these biological bases naturally create social gender, right? This idea that testosterone naturally makes men more aggressive, as opposed to the social constructionist approach, which would suggest that social relations are what typically make and teach men to be more aggressive. Now, one thing that we began to talk about last week is how the biological determinist approach ends up really marginalizing trans and gender nonconforming people. Now, this lecture is going to pick up there and begin to talk in more detail about the various ways in which transgender people and other gender nonconforming people might be marginalized within popular culture and culture more broadly. So the way we're going to do that is by first beginning to explore this really, really big concept. When I'm saying this to stress, this is another concept that you can really apply to just about anything from the course, just about anything in your life, and that's the concept of normativity. So we're going to begin the first half of the lecture by really taking this concept of normativity in and of itself and exploring what it refers to. It's a philosophical and theoretical concept. And then we're going to look at a specific system of normativity, specifically cisnormativity. Some of you might be familiar with that term yet, but if you're not, don't worry, because we are getting there in a second. So normativity overall refers to a system of values and ideas that supports particular behaviors as the norm, right? So for example, some of you might be familiar with the word normative, right? Or you might just think of the word normal as referring to things being the way they are, right? The average. And if you're a mathematics person or a science-minded person, then you know talking about the norm, right, is the same thing as talking about the average or perhaps the most commonly occurring thing, right? Now, in a world of infinite options for how to behave, various systems of thought compel us to behave in certain ways. I always find it curious, right, and I'm totally a part of this, I'm not separating myself in any way, that like given the myriad options of clothing that are available to us in the world, we all end up coming into this room and for the most part looking pretty similar, right? Very small number of fabrics that are being used to make our clothing, relatively narrow number of cuts that are used for our shirts, for our shorts, for our pants, right? In fact, some of you might actually look around and realize that you own some of the exact same clothing items as other people in the room, right? And that's certainly not bad, right? This is okay, but it is curious, right, about where this all comes from. We'd all like to think certainly that like our decisions about our clothing come from this sort of like essential sense of ourselves, right? And that we're not subject to being influenced by other people, by advertisements. But the reality is that we are, right? And that we typically find ourselves to pick from a relatively narrow set of options, right? So thinking back to previous weeks, this has a strong connection to the idea of the path of least resistance, right? I could wear a clown costume every day to teach this class. That would probably be noticed. People would probably perhaps be distracted by that clown costume, right? People would talk about it. You would probably try and sneak photos of me to put on your Instagram and be like, my professor comes in a clown costume every day, right? And then on the last day of class, I'd not come in a clown costume and be like, oh man, something serious happened in Alex's life because he's not in the clown costume today, right? But the point being, right, I dress this way perhaps, right, because I've been compelled over the course of my lifetime, the course of my professional development in the academy, to dress in a way that's considered proper, right? Now, at the same time that normativity or normative systems designate proper behavior, they implicitly designate improper behavior, right? And this is what normativity is all about, the designation of what is proper, and by implication, the designation of what is not proper, right? Improper behavior. So talking about a system like racism is not the same thing as saying white normativity, okay? So saying something is normative is not the same thing as saying it is oppressive, okay? As we'll talk about, normativity is kind of always around us, so we can talk about good sorts of normativity and bad sorts of normativity, right? So for example, like if we all learned that we just really ought to help our neighbors out when they're in need of help, right? And that was a really compelling normative system in our culture, that wouldn't be a bad thing, you know what I mean? That wouldn't be oppressive. However, if we had a normative system that suggests that everybody should fend for themselves and be individually responsible, and if you see your neighbor, you know, unable to escape from a flood that's coming, you shouldn't help them out because that's on them, right? And that's normative, that would probably be problematic. So we shouldn't be angry that things are normative. We shouldn't be angry that we feel compelled to dress in similar ways as one another, because the fact that we do that isn't necessarily oppressive per se, right? So talking about normativity isn't the same thing as talking about a benign choice that people make, right? So this is really different than saying a society-wide preference for something, right? We're talking about a system that's enforced and in particular has consequences, right? So again, right, the fact that we all mostly choose to wear t-shirts and jeans, right, or t-shirts and yoga pants, I don't know if that's the correct kind of umbrella term, right? You know, that's not a problem, right? But it does indicate a normative system at work, right? Because we're all choosing to do pretty much the same thing instead of going against that path of least resistance. Now, in philosophic thought, including in gender and women's studies, normativity is used for things. So first it's used to talk about how things should be, right? So for example, notions of parental responsibility, right? This is one thing that's normative in our society. The idea that parents ought to be present for their children, right? This is a normative belief held by most of society, right? So this is about how things should be. Normativity is also about how to value things, right? So for example, how to value parenthood. At the same time that we have a normative system that tells us you should be present for your children, we also have a normative system that tells us how to value that particular presence, right? How to give value to parents who are very involved in their children's life, supportive of various activities, right? And then we learn to devalue parents that are less present in their children's life, right? Again, a normative system. Along with that is what things are good or bad, okay? So in order to illustrate this with a bit more detail, I'm going to add on just a little bit of writing to the board. And I want us to think about sex. And when I say sex, I don't mean ideas of male and female, but I mean literally acts of sex, having sex, right? Sexuality, sexy things, interests, desires, stuff like that. So when we think about sex, okay, what sort of sex is valued in our society, right? So in other words, in our society, when do we consider it appropriate to have sex? And I'm going to leave it at that. So when do we consider it appropriate to have sex? What conditions do we think need to be met? Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with in a relationship. Okay.
Private sex.
Okay. Okay. What else? Yeah? Okay. So taking from this and this, I'm also going to suggest that another one is Jesu people. What else? Yeah.
Generally, like young to adulthood, like it talks about 8-year-olds having sex.
Okay.
So like.
That's okay. Cool. Well, like I feel almost compromised, but yes, okay. We don't talk really about this, right? So these are all things that are, to put it a different way, not taboo when it comes to sex. What are the things? Is anybody being paid? So we'll say for free. Both people are getting it for free, right? So it's like, yeah. You about to suggest one? Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess like not so much for pleasure as for procreation.
Okay. Right. Okay. So then, are there toys being used? Any outside devices? Sex swings? Nothing. So no toys. Is it on camera? Probably not, right? Not on camera. Anything else? Yeah?
We generally assume we're both like able as opposed to disabled.
Okay. Okay, so this is a pretty exhaustive list, right? Now, if sex is going to be depicted in our society, it's going to be talked about, right? these are typically the things that make it a bit more okay to talk about, right? A bit more okay to perhaps be represented in popular culture, right? So, for example, when a movie like 50 Shades of Grey gets such a kind of mixed response, right, certainly critical backlash from a lot of different sectors of society, it might indicate in part, right, that these things are still kind of taboo within mainstream, which is to say that it's not okay in our mainstream normative society to have sex with people you just met in public, aren't married to, a whole bunch of you, all different ages, paying each other different amounts of money for different acts, definitely not having any kids, using a ton of toys, filming the hell out of it, right? With people who are both able-bodied and disabled. Right? So this is the sort of sex, right? Everything that's not written here, right? That's implied by the fact that we have a normative system that values these things, right? So if you think about, for example, the push towards same-sex marriage, right? Why might same-sex marriage have become so appealing at one point in time, right? Is this narrative that we are just the same, right? So this narrative that we still want white picket fence, we want to have and raise kids, probably instill in them good religious values, support them economically, socially, culturally, right? Spend a lot of money on products, capitalism, right? All these sorts of things, right? So it makes it so that perhaps just one thing's changed, right? So for example, what I'm here is perhaps becoming a bit dated. Right? I'd say that, but I think this kind of is becoming a bit different, right? Like, in fact, very different. Like, I think overall society is pretty cool with that's happening outside of marriage, right? So that means that over time, right, we've been like, all right, listen, we're good with sex outside of marriage. That's fine. We've accepted. However, all the rest of the rules still apply, right? So we see this one shift in one thing, but at the time that we have that shift, we really reassert the rest of these things, right? So when are your parents okay with you having sex outside of marriage? When they think you're doing it with somebody who you're in a relationship with, that you're doing it in private, right? That's just the two of you, right? That you're not paying her, she's not paying you, right? That it is, well, yeah, that maybe it was right? You're not using toys, you're not filming, right? You know what I mean? If your dad is okay with you having sex with your partner because he really thinks you two are about to get married, and then he finds out that you're doing it actually on camera online for money, and that's how the two of you are supporting yourselves, right? His reaction might not be the same. And this is because systems of normativity are lengthy and detailed, right, and involve a lot of stuff. Now, along with this, obviously, I don't need to talk about this fourth point, what things are good or bad, and what actions are right or wrong, because this here is all about action, okay? Now, to help understand normativity better, some of you philosophy folks, this will be interesting. We can explore this philosophical concept called the is-ought problem, right? Now, what does the word is mean? Like, if I say something is, yeah? Concrete, actual in a way, right? Like undebated, truth, objective, right? And if I say something ought, what does that suggest? Yeah? Should, right? That should be. And therefore, implicitly, it's a personal preference or something, right? I'm suggesting the way things should be versus the way things are. Right? Now, normative statements are contrasted with positive statements because positivism involves making statements, right? So biological sciences are largely positivist enterprises, right? They believe, and I think in a very effective way, of course, I'm not disputing the very underlying principles of science, but the underlying principles of science are philosophical questions, right? So positivism might involve something like this. An atom is composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Now, in a scientific setting, you can probably conduct an experiment over and over and over and over and over again ad infinitum, and always find atoms are composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? Perhaps if I were to say the sky is blue, this would be like a positivist statement, right? There is a scientific understanding of what constitutes the color blue, right? And I'm looking at the sky, and I'm saying it is blue. Most people wouldn't debate this. Most people would agree that this is a description of something that is, right? Something that is. And that's positivism. Now, something being normative instead of something being positive is quite different, right? Now, positivism is all about science. The population of the U.S. 318.9 million people. This number's changed, no doubt, even since I started this lecture. But these are kind of like undebated factual statements, right? In a way, if you think of objectivity, this idea that you can remove yourself from something and just watch that process happen, right? This is kind of what that's about. Now, normativity, however, relies on the making of ought statements. Suggestions of how things ought to be. People should not riot. We should build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. We should impeach the president. We should smash the patriarchy with a gigantic hammer, right? These are all examples of normative statements. They're ought statements, okay? Now, a lot of normative statements are connected with ethics, right? People say things ought to be a certain way due in part to their ideas about ethical decision-making. So when people say people should not riot, right, that's not the same thing as saying rioting hasn't accomplished anything. That's not the same thing as saying people do not riot, right? As saying riots do not exist. It's not the same thing as it is statement. It's very much still an ought statement, right? People should not riot. If you hear somebody say to you, I don't think people should riot, right? It really clearly indicates their opinion on a particular issue. It doesn't indicate some sort of objective truth, right? However, it does indicate perhaps their own ethical ideas, right? Their own ideas about ethics and ethical decision-making, right? Now, normativity is really important then to understand in our field because it's an important part of systemic oppression. If we think back to the knowledge power nexus from previous weeks, we can really understand how normativity works, because what normativity does, it's so tricky, systems of normative thought, is they take these ought statements and they give them the appearance of is statements, right? Or to put it differently, they rely on making is statements, what sound like positive statements, to push a normative agenda, right? So they state something as fact to be able to enforce how things should be. They take ought statements and give them the appearance of is statements, right? So when people say that's just how things are, right? It's just the way things are, right? That's just the way things are. What they're actually saying is that's just the way things ought to be. That's the way I think things should be, right? But they give them this appearance of a positivist statement. Now, perhaps I think for me the easiest way to understand this is again referencing back to same-sex marriage, right? How many times do people hear this argument? Listen, marriage, it is what it is. It's between a man and a woman, right? I'm not opposed to gay people. I just think that marriage is this one thing. It's its definition, right? And that's it. It is what it is. Again, not homophobic, but marriage is this, right? Now, marriage isn't anything. I mean, historically, marriage has been practiced in myriad different ways, in myriad different places. It's involved two people, more than two people, people of the same sex or gender, people of different sexes or gender. Every sort of combination imaginable has existed across history, right? Our historical documents that demonstrate this are vast, right? As far as you go back in documented human history, you find evidence of non-traditional forms of marriage. And when I say non-traditional, I mean from current perspective, right? From this sort of perspective. So to say that marriage is just between a man and a woman, right, is actually denying the reality of marriage historically, right? Making a false positivist statement, and therefore kind of dodging the fact that what you're really trying to do is make a normative statement. What you're really trying to say is, I think marriage ought to just be between a man and a woman, right? So by switching to this positivist voice, you allow yourself to appear as though you are almost scientific, right? As though you're objective. You're removed from the situation. And you're like, listen, I'm not bigoted. It's just this is the way it is, right? I don't hate gay people or lesbians. It's just marriage is between a man and a woman. And we're going to talk about later in this lecture, and as you'll probably remember from last week, right, this is the same thing as folks arguing about bathroom regulations for people who are trans or gender nonconforming. People who say, listen, I'm not bigoted, but biology is what it is, right? We've already learned last week biology isn't this perfectly dimorphic ideal, right? Some people say there is biological male and there is biological female. What they don't realize, or maybe do realize they say, is I think there ought to be a biological male and a biological female, even though that is not a positivist or objective reflection of the state of sex or the state of gender in the world, right? Now, this is really important because one of the most overlooked aspects of systemic oppression is typically ideology. Like we've talked before about how institutional practices and individual behaviors always get the most attention. So with racism, for example, the focus is on institutions, the police, government officials, judges in the criminal justice system, along with individual acts of racism by anyone from members of the KKK to like random people on the street or in line at Starbucks starting to go off on a racist tirade, right? Now, considerably less attention is typically paid to ideology, referring to the ways that we think about the world, right? Now, when you think of normativity, you should automatically think of ideology, okay? Normativity and ideology both go hand in hand, right? Ideology refers broadly to systems of thought about the world, how the world is and how the world ought to be, right? Normativity is very specifically about kind of the making of ought statements, right? Or the implying of how things should be, okay? So, if you're thinking about kind of concept mapping, right, doing reading reflections, there's all these really obvious linkages, right? So we kind of began, of course, by talking about this concept of representation. Right? Now, representation, right, gives ideas about groups. Those ideas become knowledge, right? And that knowledge is powerful. People act on it, right? People often act on it in ways that indicate the working of the path of least resistance. They've seen all these consistent representations and learned, and they know that this is the way people are, this is the way I should be, and therefore I'm going to act in this particular way, right? Now, when we think of knowledge power, this naturally links into ideology, right? So if you see, right, it's as simple as if you see the same representation, if you see always that every Latino woman in every major motion picture that you watch always ends up playing the role of maid, right? 5-year-old you is going to learn and begin to think that Latino women belong in that particular position, right? That's their natural position, their natural form of work, right? So this becomes ideological, right? Now, ideology immediately then links into systemic oppression, right? You have institutions, your individual behaviors, and then these individual behaviors, right? Ideology leads into individual behaviors because normativity works right in this space, right? So we have ideologies about the world, about how the world works, and those ideologies also imply normative statements for how the world ought to be, right? So talking about a system of, for example, white normativity, if I were to say something like white normativity, right, which would assume perhaps to mean a system that suggests that we ought to privilege whiteness, right? That might be a normative system, right, that contributes to racism, right? If this here is our graphing of systemic racism. So you want to begin to think in these various ways, right? Be linking concepts together in this sort of way, so that if on one of your papers, right, if on midterm, if on the final, you're asked to explain how different concepts relate, you can quickly be like, oh, you want me to explain how the path of least resistance relates to institutions that are part of systemic racism? Well, I can totally do that, right? You know? So, or you could even actually, you could just draw the link right over here of the path of least resistance to being all about individual behaviors, and that would be good too. So, because all three aspects of systemic oppression are linked, ideological beliefs that are normative, right, that we take as natural and normal, dictate simultaneously how institutions should operate and how individual behaviors should go, how individuals should act, right? And what that means then is that when we see shifts, okay, when we see shifts in institutional practices or individual behaviors, and we take those positive shifts as indicating that this system has fundamentally changed, right? So when you hear people, we learned this, we were taught this, and it's so problematic, but we were taught this all the time in high school, right? We were taught that civil rights ended racism, right? This is an idea out there that's put out by so many history teachers that because of the Civil Rights Acts in the 1950s and 60s, that those Civil Rights Acts ended racism. Now, what approach would that be? Institutional, individual, or ideological? Yeah. Institutional, right? We're talking about political institutions. The idea was that we changed these laws, we've desegregated schools, we've expanded voting rights to include black women, right? All these sorts of things, and therefore equality exists, right? We've ended racism. Now, the problem is that this shift didn't accomplish or correspond with dramatic shifts in individual behaviors, dramatic shifts in ideological belief systems, right? In fact, when we saw these institutional shifts, what we saw is an increase in KKK activity, right, in response to that. We saw an increase, right, in kind of ideological propaganda directed at people to support racism, to support segregation, right? So we saw an increase in these things, right? Now, this isn't to say that the world isn't progressing, right? But it is to say we don't want to get duped into this idea that progress happens like this, right? We want to understand that progress happens like this, right? There's the up and down moments and the changes that happen we're not on this just perfect path, right? Things aren't always getting better every day no matter what. Things oftentimes dip down, get worse, right? And perhaps get better to a better state than they've ever been before. I say this all to be able to highlight what I think is a really important discussion, unfortunately one which I'm not going to be able to spend as much time as I would like with because of how far into the class we're all today, and that is by talking about what happened when slavery ended, right? Now, a lot of people are under the mindset that slavery, when it was ended, led to an immediate massive reduction in the number of African Americans who were working for free for somebody else for life, right? Now, who here is also familiar with the term indentured servitude? Right? So the notion of indentured servitude comes, we learned it probably through learning about the history of immigration to the United States, that there were people who wanted to come to the U.S., they couldn't afford it, and essentially what they agreed is to have somebody pay their passage to the United States and then work off their debt then, right? What did you learn about indentured servitude, the people who ended up finding themselves in? Was it like a really clear 5-year work plan, and then at the end of 5 years, they always found themselves going back out into society? Yeah.
Usually the people who brought them over would, add on to their debt and say, oh, but I've been feeding you, so that's another 2 years. And, oh, but I'm doing this, so that's another. So your math's off, you need to stay for another XYZ years.
Right. So this is exactly what ended up happening right here. Now, when slavery was ended, what ended up happening instead was all of these states across the South switched their laws to effectively be able to maintain slavery, but in a different form. What all these southern states did is they passed laws that made it illegal to have debt, right? They passed laws that made it illegal to live on the street, to not have a house, right? To not have a place to live, right? All these sorts of laws that were meant to target now free black people, right? Now, people who were freed at the time of the ending of slavery didn't immediately have a whole bunch of economic opportunity, right? There wasn't this world of jobs that opened up for them, right? It's not like the former slave owners turned around and were like, cool, well, I'm more than happy to switch to a system of paying, right? A system of wages, right? Instead, all of these states basically found as many excuses as possible to arrest black people for what were considered, I'm trying to think of the categorical name, but essentially, basically, to name these sorts of laws, but like debtor laws is one of them. But all these laws about things that should not be illegal, right? Like it shouldn't be illegal to be homeless. It shouldn't be a jailable offense to have debt. And actually nowadays we think of it as almost ridiculous because back then that was very different. That was very rare. Whereas here like that's just very normal, right? Student loans, all sorts of debt is just very normal now. But it used to be, right? So all these laws were essentially used so that almost at the moment of becoming free, southern states could re-arrest black people, and then instead of jailing them, required them to work their sentences, right? On oftentimes the same plantations that they were on prior, right? Slave owners would have to do what they always did, provide food, right? But that was it, right? So what you ended up seeing was this massive shift, right, between slavery and what we oftentimes refer to as chattel slavery, this modified form of indentured servitude, right? And why is it important to stress this in a discussion of normativity and ideology? It's because when slavery was ended, one thing that fundamentally didn't change is this undergirding American ideology of freedom and individualism and individual liberty, right? Fundamentally, if you think about everybody who read back, when we read about the forefathers, or even pre-revolutionary times, when we read about, who was it that said, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death to right say it. Was that John Locke? No, it wasn't John Locke. Rousseau, yeah, it was Rousseau, right? Yeah. Right, all these British and French philosophers, right, that were writing a lot in the late 1600s or 1700s, and we think about all our forefathers, right, and we think about the way we talk about the Constitution, our forefathers, as though, like, they knew the perfect answer and their fundamental value system is best. If we stray away from the Constitution, like, the whole world's gonna burn, right, even though all of these guys were slave owners who lived, like, 300 plus years ago when racism was, like, totally normalized, right? So, now, these undergirding systems, this undergirding belief in individualism, individual liberty, and freedom, is this really fundamentally American system that has a track, right? If we believe that everybody is this rational actor, this self-actualizing individual who is always acting in their best interests, making what they think are the best decisions for themselves, right? And what we end up with a system of individual liberty, also a system of individual responsibility, right? And this is still really prevalent. People think that poor people are poor because they are bad decision makers, or that is an individual failing or an individual problem, right? But any sort of analysis of systemic oppression, right? If you believe in systemic analysis of racism, if you believe in a systemic analysis of sexism, then what you understand is individual behaviors are only one of three things that determines our lot in life, right? And we can be a kick-ass individual, right? But we're still working within institutions and ideological belief systems that militate against us, right? I don't know if anybody was ever raised as a woman or raised as a person of color by parents that told you you had to work twice as hard to get half as much, right? That kind of way of thinking indicates that individual behaviors, even if you just, kick ass, right, still end up coming against these institutional practices, right? If you watch the final of the Women's U.S. Open over the weekend, that is a perfect example of this, right? The standalone, probably most successful, best athlete in the world, right, Serena Williams, still ends up coming against this sexist institution of tennis refereeing, right, that in no way targets men when they take off their shirts to change their shirts on the court, right, but when a woman simply rotates her shirt 180 degrees at the U.S. Open, she gets tagged like a game for it. If I see the nodding along, Celia, I'm assuming you were following the U.S. Open, right? So this sort of double standard means that Serena, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think Serena was, I was watching the whole final, I think Serena was perhaps on track to lose the final anyway, like, Naomi Osaka was playing just a fantastic game, right? However, right, people kind of walk away from it, right, without paying due respect to this kind of institutional side of things, right? The fact that that loss is bigger than just Serena's own performance within that, right? But it also comes within this institutional and ideological context, right? So bringing it back to this, at the time that you saw the ending of slavery, right, even though people who were fighting to end slavery recognized that it was a problematic institution, you still didn't then see this challenge to this notion of individual responsibility, right? People literally were thinking, all right, we end slavery, and then at that point, anything that happens to black people, anything that happens to African Americans is their own individual responsibility, right? Now, we know in this day and age that slavery in no way represented an end of racism. However, we were taught in school something much more recent, and that's that the civil rights movement did. But the civil rights movement in no way ended the ideological belief that individuals are responsible for their own lot in life, an ideological belief that literally ignores the role that institutions play in our lives, right? So, skip that slide and come here. So, any study of culture, broadly speaking, can similarly be a study of normative assumptions. The same way that we talked about, like, oh, if you look at all of this particular sitcom from the 1980s, you can learn about what people thought and cared about sex and sexuality at that time, right? You can also learn about normative assumptions, right? So if you watch, for example, TV sitcoms with strong female leads, right? TV sitcoms with strong female leads, which I actually think is like a Netflix category in and of itself, right? If you do, and you start to look at, okay, well, what's the ethical or moral lesson that's being taught at the end of these shows, you might find that you still have this sort of societal concern there, this concern that if women become too powerful and successful, they won't be able to still be mothers, right? So you have all these sorts of shows where you have a really strong female lead, where at the end of episodes, right, anytime there's tension between her work life and her family, at the end of the episodes, she ends up coming back and realizing, no, I have the ability to be a full-time mother and somehow a full-time vice president of the United States, right? I'm thinking of one show in particular. So now, you might then watch this show, right, and ask, well, what are our normative assumptions as a society at that time based off of the reading of this show? And you might conclude that our society now normatively assumes that women should be out in the workplace, be wage earners, but also at the time that women still should be able to return to this very traditional role of playing the mother, right? And we understand this, if anybody's heard the term like the second shift. This is one way of talking about it when you have, I don't know if anybody grew up in a household like this, you have two parents, both are working full-time, both are making money, but still your mom is the only one who does like the domestic work inside the house, the only one who does the cooking and cleaning, right? So yeah. So by studying stuff like TV shows and looking at these sorts of artifacts, looking at these messages, we can learn about how a society thought things ought to be, especially if we see that same representation over and over and over and over again. Now, the rest of this lecture is going to practice this sort of inquiry by looking at one particular type of normative thought, specifically the ideology of cis-sexism, or the ideology found within the cis system of cis-sexism. So what we're going to learn in a second, we'll take a couple-minute break in just a second so folks can stretch, check their phones, whatever. We're going to learn that there is a normative way of being cisgender, right? And that manifests in cultural practices in the United States. And by investigating U.S. culture, we can learn about how we think at any moment in time people should do their sex, do their gender, or do their sexuality. So let's take a pause for a couple minutes. At 11:49, I'll holler at you so we can get going, okay? Oh, the cartoon. Oh, yeah, I saw the cartoon and the analysis. I mean, it speaks volumes, and it's an Australian newspaper, which is by no means surprising, because racism in Australia is, like, particularly intense, but the way in which they market tourism certainly doesn't tend to that particular reality. All right, so finish up whatever you're doing. All right. So, we're going to begin by talking about the topic of transphobia. Now, who here is just on some level familiar with this term, has heard this term, transphobia or transphobic before, right? So, broadly speaking, it refers to the fear, hatred, rejection, and systemic oppression of trans people. And related to that is the notion of cis-sexism or cisgenderism, both of which are topics that have received a lot of popular attention. Now, while many of you are probably familiar with the term transphobic, you might be less familiar with the term cisgender or cisnormativity. Now, cisgender refers to people whose gender identities match their sex assigned at birth, right? In other words, this is probably the vast majority of people in the West the majority of people in this classroom as well, right? People who, at the moment that they were born, the doctor yelled and everybody yelled, it's a boy, and for the rest of their life they identified as male, right? This would refer to somebody who is cisgender. Now, when we think about normativity, we can approach it in two ways when considering the experiences of trans people. First off, and most important initially, is the concept of cisnormativity, right? Now, normative, things ought to be that way. Cis referring to cisgender, right? So cisnormativity is the enforcement of a sex and gender binary that refuses space for non-cisgender people, right? In other words, cisnormativity is a system of thought that suggests that all people ought to be cisgender, right? In fact, what's so dangerous about cisnormativity, as it's with a lot of systems of cisnormativity, is it takes an ought statement and makes it appear like an is statement, right? The same people who believe that everybody ought to be cisgender will find ways to suggest and insist that everybody is cisgender, perhaps by referring back to this totally false biological dimorphic ideal. So that's one system of normativity, right? That is kind of a societal-wide system of normativity, right? And if we think about this in a simple way, we can think about the way in which we understand coming out relative to trans identity, right? We assume everybody is cisgender at the moment of birth, assign them a gender, even have parties ahead of time, right? Where we celebrate the gender of the kid at the party, right, before the kid has even been born, right? The gender reveal parties, right? I had one, my neighbors had one a few weeks before the semester began, and they built a giant paper mache like woman, like a half-size woman, who they made out of paper mache to be in the birthing position, and they put her on the dining room table, but then they had like her vaginal canal open, so the mother of the baby had to reach into this paper mache woman, and the color of the confetti that she pulled out corresponded with the gender of her. I mean, this is like that some weird stuff, right? You know, like, can't we just cut the cake and it's blue or pink on the inside, right? But anyway, but this sort of thing, right? This sort of gender reveal party, the statement of it's a boy or it's a girl at the moment of birth, right? These are all examples of cisnormativity, of the way in which we assume that somebody is cisgender until they tell us otherwise, right? And not only just assume, but we really enforce it. We really push them towards it. In fact, the very notion of socializing our children into gender roles, being like, don't do that, that's not for boys, right? Don't play with that, that's not for girls, are all reflections of this sort of cisnormative world, right? Whereas what happens when some father takes his son to go and buy a princess outfit at the costume store, some other dad in the store starts yelling at him and being like, why are you raising your son this way, right? This is all kind of examples of that. Now, transnormativity is notably different. Transnormativity refers to the creation and enforcement of standards for how to be properly trans, right? In other words, transnormativity is the notion that if you are trans, you ought to be this way. And as we learn about normativity, it's going beyond the ought statement and making it an is statement. In other words, transnormativity is the assumption that if you are trans, you are a particular way. And we're going to talk about that in a tiny bit. But transnormativity and cisnormativity are both normative systems that can be enforced by people even if they don't benefit from those systems, right? So in other words, transnormativity, aspects of transnormative thought, might be supported by some trans individuals, right? Even though it is a system of normativity that stands to marginalize people within the trans community itself, right? Now, cisnormativity, again, is the set of beliefs, ideologies that support and maintain practices which marginalize non-cisgender people or assume and support the idea that everybody is cis, right? In a systematic sense, this means that this normative system reflects not only a general set of ideological beliefs, but also institutional practices and individual behaviors that emerge from those beliefs, right? So I want everybody to take a moment to brainstorm on your own, right, just for a second, an example that you're familiar with regarding transphobia, right? So what's an example of transphobia, right? It might be very specific, it might be broad, that you're familiar with, right? That you've come to understand to be a transphobic act, right? And so go ahead and do that first. I'm going to write some of them down as folks come up with them. All right, so who can give me an example of something?
I mean, an easy one would be like assuming someone's gender, you know, like without even knowing them
Okay.
on an individual basis.
Okay, this would be a good example, right? Assuming someone's gender. Yeah.
Refusing to call someone by their preferred pronouns.
Okay. Is that right? Are there two R's in preferred? Does this look good? You know, when you can't look at it, you write it the right way, but it still looks wrong. Using preferred pronouns. Right, and what corresponds kind of similar to this, not using preferred name, right? Referring to somebody by the name they had before they transitioned or before they came out as trans. This is called dead naming, by the way. This is the term that we use for it often. Dead naming, yeah.
I guess on an institutional level, allowing people to use their bathroom.
Okay. So to think in terms of transphobic, preventing bathroom choice. Yeah.
Another institutional level, preventing people from entering a country. So like
Okay.
Saudi Arabia not allowing transgender people to enter their country.
Yeah.
For a statements, like you're so great for a trans person.
Okay, yeah. Right, so in each of these examples, these are all examples of either an individual, an institutional, or an ideological practice, right? On some sort of level, right? Now, I mean, here we have individual, individual, institutional, right? This is individual, and all of these are entirely ideological, right? Because they all, right, reference back to this sort of cisnormative assumption that everybody is born cisgender until they identify elsewhere or in another way. Now here's a somewhat longer list, right? Individually misgendering somebody and then especially insisting on or continuing to do so, using the use of the term it, right? Kind of this very objectifying, non-human term. Assuming other people's gender identities before knowing them. Refusing to use gender-neutral terms if somebody says they prefer the term they or them. Right? Institutionally, exclusion of trans health issues from coverage, creation of laws policing bathrooms. Now, ideologically, the belief in a sex or gender binary, right, on a biological level, and belief in biological determination. These are both examples of transphobic or cis-normative actions, beliefs, etc. Right? So what this indicates to us is that our ideas about, our ideologies, right, about biological sex, these is statements, lead to normative judgments about how people should do their supposedly authentic gender, right? So, in other words, ideologies about biology turn into ideologies about society, right? The assumption that our biology should dictate societal behavior, societal organization, right? Now, a lot of cis-sexist or cis-normative beliefs are not necessarily held maliciously, right? A lot of people really are so insistent on belief in this biological sex and gender binary that they really do not believe that they are doing something intentionally malicious, right? However, in the process of holding on to those ideological beliefs and using them to justify particular institutional or individual behaviors, they are. Now, perhaps a bit more nuanced of a concept, and perhaps much newer to most of the folks in this room, is the concept of transnormativity. Now, this refers again to the assertion or enforcement of normative assumptions about how trans people are supposed to do their gender identity, right? Now, transnormativity is something that I really see as being quite common among cisgender allies, right? Folks who consider themselves to be well-educated, consider themselves to be woke, and don't realize that they have a very, very narrow understanding of the diversity of trans experiences in the world, and therefore try and force a single narrative onto their trans friends, right, the people that they're allies with, even though not all trans people necessarily adhere to these transnormative ideas, right? Now, I'm gonna actually skip ahead on this. I want to be sensitive to time and not. So here are some examples of transnormativity. Now, the belief that all trans people want to have gender-affirming surgeries, right? Some people, again, perhaps well-intentioned, when they meet someone who is openly trans, they might be like, oh, have you had your surgery yet? Or do you plan to have your surgery, right? Perhaps intending to appear as an ally, right? Appear empathetic, right? However, in the process of doing so, end up reinforcing this transnormative belief that all trans people want to have surgeries, right? Now, belief in a form of authentic womanhood or manhood that can be achieved through specific means, right? This idea that all trans women want to accomplish a particular aesthetic, right? Want to perfectly perform femininity in this sort of ideal society-held way, right? Policing of genderqueer expressions of oneself, right? This relates back to the enforcement of a gender binary. So, for example, if we think about which trans women are accepted in our society, typically we see that trans women who adhere to the standards of normative femininity end up being the most accepted, right? What that means is that, for example, if you're a trans woman who has facial hair, right? Or if you are a trans woman who has a lower voice, right? Chances are you're more likely to be marginalized as a trans woman than a trans woman who adheres to all of these standards of traditional ideal femininity. And for those of you who are already kind of aware of what our readings are for the week, you might begin to be understanding how a lot of this relates to how the public responded to Caitlyn Jenner coming out, right? Now, enforcing notions of legitimacy regarding male and female sex gender categories, right? Like this notion that if you do transition in these particular ways, you legitimately become male and female. This idea that there are legitimate and illegitimate men or legitimate and illegitimate women. Along with that, respectability politics, right? The idea that if you're going to be trans, you want to do it in a way that's really respectable, really attentive to other people's needs, preferences, and even perhaps biases. Again, kind of more broadly, this reliance on a single narrative of trans experiences. So, for example, as we're going to read in the Caitlyn Jenner article for this week, this kind of idea, this narrative of being born in the wrong body, right? Right? This narrative that trans people are people who were born in the wrong body, and therefore we assume that the natural way in which they can actualize their gender identity or affirm their gender identity is only through surgeries that modify their body to be the body that they wish they had been born into, right? So when we enforce this wrong body narrative onto all people, this is another example of kind of like a single narrative. Similarly, enforcement of coming out narratives, the idea that in order to be properly trans, you have to be publicly out, right, as trans. And again, each of these examples are practiced by both trans and cisgender people alike, right? So there are transgender people who enforce these ways of thinking. However, much more important to stress is that largely the vast majority of cisgender people, and I would even contend perhaps the majority of cisgender allies of the trans community, still end up believing in these sorts of ideas about sex, gender, and transgender identity. Now, yeah, it's important to remember also that normative systems are typically intersectional. So if we take, for example, heteronormativity as a system of belief, it's not only concerned with sexuality, but also with race, gender, and class. So heteronormativity is, we've talked about it before, the assumption that everybody is heterosexual, the enforcement of that assumption, and that's how we get things like coming out, right? Like, straight people don't have to come out. They never have to sit down with their parents and say, Mom and Dad, like, I'm really sorry, this must be tough, but I plan on marrying a boy and having children. You know, this doesn't happen too often. Well, I mean, be interesting. There's some really good college humor sketches about what would happen if the world was, like, homonormative and people did have to come out as straight, and, like, how hard it would be to date as a straight person in that world, and they're really, really funny, actually. But this idea about heteronormativity is more than about just simply being straight, right? Heteronormativity isn't like, as long as you're straight, anything else is okay, right? Heteronormativity is also about not only should you be straight, but the sex that you have should be with someone who you're in a relationship with, perhaps married to, largely for procreative purposes, not on camera, not for money, right? All these sorts of things. So these systems of normativity are really, really intersectional, right? For example, if you if you search Neil Patrick Harris family, right? Oh, geez, they're just perfect, aren't they? They're picturesque, right? Almost like cut out of a magazine. Some of these might be cut out of magazines, right? When you look at images of Neil Patrick Harris, right, and his family, with his husband, I think David Burka, yeah, and their two kids, right? They look like almost the cookie-cutter family, right? You can imagine what their home life is like. You can imagine how fun Christmas must be at the NPH household, right? And our society has largely, broadly in the United States accepted them and even celebrated them as this kind of perfect, picturesque couple who support their children in all the ways that you would want them to, show them good experiences, and are clearly financially supportive of them, right? Now, Caleb and Cordell were kind of a social media famous couple, along with their kids. So this is them with their kids over there. More photos of them, right? And so when folks first started seeing photos of them, this was the one that really went viral, of them doing their girls' hair in the morning, right? People went like crazy. Were really, really excited, right? And the reception to them was pretty positive, right? Now, if you notice in most of the photos of them, they also kind of have this sort of middle class, right? Here we see obviously Christian, wealthy, supportive sort of environment for their children. Now, Caleb and Cordell at one point were thinking about getting divorced, right? And this came out publicly. And the second this came out publicly, the backlash was vicious. And you saw all this sort of stuff stirred up about notions of same-sex couples not being supportive parents, and then you also saw a lot of racist and stereotypical narratives being deployed about black fathers, right? This idea that black fathers are not as present for their children, right? Now, Caleb and Cordell ended up remaining together, and I'm sure the internet was very excited about that. But this sort of way in which people talk about and accept same-sex couples indicates that heteronormativity also has this other side, right? Which is homonormativity. Ideas about how to be properly gay, right? In other words, our society has said, listen, we're willing to accept some trans people, we're willing to accept some gay people, some lesbians, right? But it's only if they do their sexuality or do their gender in a way that still is perfectly picturesque in every other aspect, right? Perfectly ideal in every other aspect. So these systems of normativity are intersectional, right? They relate to other systems. So if we think about Caitlyn Jenner, for example, when Caitlyn Jenner came out as trans, her coming out was really, really accepted, okay? And when Caitlyn Jenner came out, it was, if anybody remembers, there was the Vanity Fair cover, and then the Call Me Caitlyn show, right? These both came out at the same time. They were both released, I think, within the same week. And Caitlyn Jenner's transition was seemingly overnight, right? In a very short amount of time, Caitlyn was able to have different surgeries, start taking hormones, and also to be able to pay for a lot of the things that she needed to transition in the way that she saw fit, right? Now, this, and I want to stress this, we're not here, and the point of this lesson, the point of the article, is very clearly not to say that Caitlyn Jenner should have come out in a different way, right? We really want to avoid this sort of easy trap where we want to demonize people who do follow the path of least resistance that's been set up for them, especially when those people are in marginalized populations, right? So, for example, you don't want to walk away from this class and think to yourself, like, women who dress in a way that indicates they've been influenced by the male gaze are the problem, right? Not at all. The problem is this bigger system, right? Is male individual actions, right? Is these representational practices of the media that only show us representations of women that come through the male gaze. So we really want to be cautious about demonizing individuals who are marginalized by these systems and trying to take the path of least resistance within them in order to avoid as much of that marginalization as possible. But we do want to be able to analyze and think about why Caitlyn Jenner was so well received, right, by the American public compared to other trans celebrities and non-celebrity trans individuals. And as the article you're going to read will contend, that's because Caitlyn Jenner's coming out fell in line with the dictates of traditional femininity, right? How she cultivates her aesthetic, the clothes that she wears, the trappings of wealth, all these sorts of things ended up making her coming out ideal, right? This sort of ideal coming out for the American public who is looking for kind of one small difference, right? This sort of one small difference to have someone who can be trans but still support capitalism, whiteness, Christianity, right? All these sorts of other systems, right? Again, this is the intersectional side of it. So, your first reading for this week is Call Me Caitlyn. I think both of these readings are in your packet, so you don't need to lug your book with you on Thursday. Hold on before packing up. So in this piece, Lovelock, the author, looks at 3 pop cultural topics that relate to trans representation and analyzes their impacts. More than anything else, he looks to identify how popular culture relates to normative ideas about gender, specifically transgender identity. In other words, he's looking to find out, okay, how does popular culture tell all of us, tell the masses, how to do our gender, how to do our femininity? He further draws out conclusion about the gender impressions women in general faced in terms of doing bodily work, what he terms bodily work. So Michael Lovelock says, by looking at Caitlyn Jenner's coming out, we can actually learn about pressures that all women, right, not just trans women, all women in our society face. So some of the questions that you want to think about are what does Lovelock describe as the stereotypical narrative about gender identity for trans individuals? Remember, I kind of hinted at it, this wrong body narrative. What normative effects does that narrative or paradigm have? In other words, how does that way of thinking compel people to behave in a certain way, compel trans people to do their identity or transition in a certain way? What is bodily work, and why is it important, right? And how does the concept of transnormativity appear in the text? You're not going to see the word transnormativity necessarily, but the concept of it, how to be properly trans, is omnipresent in the text. The next reading that you're going to read, and for those of you who have maybe seen Trans America, this will be an interesting reading for you, is The Trans Romance Dilemma in Trans America and Other Films by Tracy Abbott. Abbott focuses her analysis on the representation of trans characters in mainstream media and specifically in romantic roles in popular culture to assess if, when, and how those characters challenge cis and or trans normative ideas. So her analysis is similar to Lovelock's, but her analysis is instead turned towards thinking about cisnormativity and towards romantic depictions. So one of the important things that she identifies is how many representations of romantic situations with trans characters often turns humor or transphobic representations to avoid the really complicated and important work of depicting trans individuals in romantic roles that are more honest, nuanced, and reflective of the diversity of trans experiences of romance. So what I want you to think is, first off, how does Abbott's piece connect to last week's readings about biological determinism and gender determination? What stereotypical tropes do you see in most movies with trans characters? In other words, what are kind of these main kind of stereotypical roles that you see trans characters in movies? How do media with trans characters reinforce cissexism or biological determinism? And what sorts of alternative representations would be positive in terms of the portrayal of romantic trans characters? So come on Thursday ready to answer these questions. These readings are a bit more difficult than some of the ones that we've had in the past. All right? And I know, again, 12:30 to 3:30, I'm in my office if anyone has questions.